when the plague wasn't just a metaphor. So picture this. You wake up, open your shutters, and instead of birds chirping, you hear a bell ringing and someone yelling, "Bring out your dead, welcome to the Middle Ages," aka humanity's rough draft. But hey, who needs running water and antibiotics when you've got leeches and holy water, right? This video isn't just about history class throwbacks or some dusty chronicle of misery. Nope. We're diving headfirst into how medieval communities, peasants, nobles, plague doctors with questionable fashion sense actually handled outbreaks. And spoiler alert, they weren't just sitting around waiting to die. Well, some were, but that's beside the point. Think quarantine is a 21st century concept? Think again. You'll be surprised at how many modern ideas actually have roots in a time when people thought sneezing was a sign from God and rats were just part of the decor. But before we get into plague masks, city lockdowns, and the medieval version of social distancing, which mostly involved locking people in towers or churches, let's be real. History is messy. It's not some fairy tale with noble knights and perfectly timed heroic speeches. It's gross, chaotic, and occasionally smells like boiled cabbage. But it's also fascinating, because if you squint a little, the Middle Ages start to look a whole lot like now. So why are we talking about this? Because, as it turns out, medieval folks had a few things figured out. Sure, they also believed demons caused disease, but hey, so do some people on Facebook. In a world where misinformation spreads faster than the flu, maybe it's time to learn a thing or two from people who didn't have Wi-Fi but still managed to organize quarantines. Buckle up. It's about to get historically contagious. And then the year of our Lord went off the rails. Let's talk plagues, not the metaphorical kind where your Wi-Fi dies during a Zoom meeting, but the real deal. Boils, blood, and body carts kind of plague. And trust me, the Middle Ages had them in bulk. The greatest hits? The Plague of Justinian in the 6th century, and of course the headliner, the Black Death in the 14th century. If pandemics had a Hall of Fame, these two would be top tier. Now imagine this. You're living your best medieval life, working the fields, praying you don't get drafted into a crusade, when suddenly people start dropping like flies. And by flies, we mean entire towns. Entire towns gone. 1 minute you're sipping watered-down ale, the next your neighbor is coughing up blood. Yay, history. The Black Death alone wiped out about 1/3 of Europe's population. That's not a typo. 1/3. We're talking about a pandemic that made COVID look like a minor system update. People had no idea what hit them, literally. There were no germ theories, no PCR tests, and definitely no daily case dashboards. They blamed bad air, angry gods, planetary misalignment, even minorities, because of course they did. And how did the plague get around? It hitched a ride, on fleas, on rats, on ships full of goods and sailors who were definitely not feeling a bit under the weather. Globalization, medieval edition. Thanks, Silk Road. The result? Panic. People ran from cities, locked their doors, burned incense, and prayed like their lives depended on it. Spoiler, they did. Some turned to religion, others to wine. A few brave souls kept diaries that make modern-day Twitter threads look tame. So, when you hear someone say, "Things have never been this bad before," kindly remind them that at least they're not hauling a plague cart through the streets yelling, "Unclean," perspective people. Next up, medieval hygiene. Or, well, the attempt at it. Where there's soap, or lack of it, there's hope. Let's address the stinky elephant in the medieval room, hygiene. Because when we think Middle Ages, we usually imagine muddy streets, questionable smells, and people who considered a yearly bath a bold lifestyle choice. Spoiler, not entirely wrong, but also not the full story. Contrary to the myth that everyone in medieval Europe was allergic to water, people did care about cleanliness. Kind of. Public bathhouses were a thing, especially in cities. They were like the OG wellness spas, minus the eucalyptus oil and cucumber water, plus a lot more naked strangers and, syphilis. Hygiene wasn't just for the elites either. Peasants washed too, especially hands and faces. You know, the basics. Just not as often as you'd hope. But here's where it gets tragic. Around the time plagues started popping off, people actually stopped bathing regularly. Why? Because doctors, and I use that term loosely, thought water opened the pores and let disease in. So yes, they believed cleanliness made you more vulnerable to illness. Genius? Instead, they douse themselves in perfumes, carry little scented pouches, or just marinate in their own natural musk. Ode to 14th century. Lovely. Meanwhile, the streets? Literal trash lanes. People tossed waste out windows. Sewage systems were primitive or non-existent. And rats? Let's just say they weren't guests. They were roommates. No rent, just plague. But here's the weird part. People still made connections between filth and disease. They noticed that dirty areas got hit harder. Some cities even started cleaning up during outbreaks, sweeping streets, banning certain waste, even limiting gatherings in bad air zones. So, yeah. Somewhere under all that mud, a hygiene revolution was brewing. Flash forward to us panic buying hand sanitizer in 2020, and maybe medieval folks weren't so far behind. They were just working with less science and more superstition. And yet, they still managed to figure out, maybe living ankle-deep in dung isn't great for public health. Coming up next, how medieval quarantine wasn't all that different from your lockdown Netflix binge. Quarantine, not just pajamas and banana bread. Let's get one thing straight. Quarantine wasn't invented by modern health officials or introverts with a Netflix account. Nope. Medieval folks were already putting "stay home, save lives" into action, minus the Zoom fatigue. The OG quarantine? That came from Venice in the 14th century, right around the time the Black Death was doing its world tour. Ships arriving from plague-hit areas were told to sit tight offshore for 40 giorni, 40 days. Yep, that's where the word quarantine comes from. Bet you didn't learn that on TikTok. Why 40? Well, partly because it sounded holy. The Bible loves the number 40. 40 days of rain, 40 years in the desert, 40 days of fasting. Medieval logic. If it worked for Jesus, it works for us. And this wasn't just a chill time out. Guards patrolled harbors, cargo was isolated, even mail got fumigated. No Uber Eats, no essential worker loopholes. Just you, your crew, and a whole lot of rats for company. Ahoy! On land, cities got creative. Some shut their gates entirely. Others banned outsiders, held mass funerals by the truckload, cartload, and created plague houses, places where the sick were locked in, sometimes with bricks sealing the door. Harsh? Yes. Effective? Kind of. Depending on your definition of effective and your tolerance for civil rights violations. Even rural villages like Am in England made the ultimate sacrifice. When the plague hit, they isolated themselves completely. No one in, no one out, for over a year. People died, but the disease didn't spread beyond them. Real-life medieval lockdown heroes. And all without Wi-Fi or sourdough starter kits. So next time you complain about staying home in your sweatpants, remember, at least no one's nailing your door shut or sending your Amazon package in a fumigated barrel. Up next, how medieval societies pulled together, sometimes impressively, sometimes like a group project gone horribly wrong. Collective responsibility beta version. Let's talk teamwork, because as much as we like to imagine medieval people as clueless serfs wandering around saying thee and thou, they actually had a solid grasp of one thing. Surviving meant working together. Welcome to the Middle Ages version of We're All in This Together, minus the musical numbers. When plague hit, some cities didn't wait for a royal decree or a papal memo. They took matters into their own unwashed hands. Town councils, merchant guilds, even local lords got busy organizing what we now call public health responses. Imagine your city's HOA suddenly becoming the CDC, and you're close. Cities like Milan, surprisingly ahead of the curve, took drastic measures. They straight up walled in infected houses, brick and mortar, no metaphors. Harsh but effective. Florence, slightly more chaotic. Think less organized response and more rich people fleeing to country villas while poor folks were left to fend for themselves. So, not that different from today, really. And guess what? People did follow rules. There were fines for breaking curfews, sneaking out of infected areas, or attending illegal gatherings. Yes, even medieval folks couldn't resist a plague rave. Sure, some ignored the rules, human nature, right? But a surprising number played along. Why? Because they understood something basic. If your neighbor dies, you might be next. Also, let's give a shout-out to religious communities. Monasteries and convents didn't just sit around chanting, they often turned into hospitals and care centers. Did some of them die trying? Absolutely. Were they heroes? Also yes. Even if their medicine was just prayer and a few herbs, the intent was there. Bottom line, when the world started falling apart, a lot of people stepped up. Not because they had to, but because it was the only way to not go full apocalypse mode. Kinda inspiring if you ignore the occasional mob violence and superstition-fueled chaos. Next up, how disinfection in the Middle Ages was equal parts creative, desperate, and utterly ineffective. Medieval disinfection, fire, flowers, and wishful thinking. So, how do you disinfect a city when your medical degree is basically just read the Bible and hope for the best? Welcome to the medieval version of public sanitation, where science meets superstition and everything smells like burning herbs. First off, people in the Middle Ages genuinely believed that bad air, aka miasma, caused disease. If the air smelled funky, death was probably lurking somewhere nearby. Logical? Not really, but given their limited options, it kind of made sense. Enter incense, bonfires, and perfumed accessories. Because if you can't kill the plague, at least you can vibe check it with lavender. Doctors and priests recommended lighting fires in the streets to purify the air. Not small candles, mind you, we're talking legit smoke machines. Picture it, plague outside, people indoors with all windows closed, roasting alive because someone said fire scares germs away. Spoiler, it didn't. And then there were the posies, little nosegays filled with flowers, herbs, and whatever smelled nicer than rotting corpses. People wore them around their necks, stuffed them in masks, or just waved them around like medieval air fresheners. Fun fact, this is where the infamous "ring around the rosy" rhyme comes from. Yep, your childhood nursery rhyme was about mass death. Sweet dreams. As for actual cleaning, medieval cities didn't really do bleach and scrub brushes. Instead, they might sprinkle vinegar or wine on things. Some even tried fumigating letters with smoke or lemon juice, the 14th century version of sanitize your Amazon box. Also, remember those creepy birdbeak masks, the ones worn by plague doctors? Those weren't just for looks, though let's admit it. They were a whole aesthetic. The beaks were filled with aromatic herbs meant to filter out bad air. Functionally useless, fashionably iconic. In short, medieval disinfection was a whole performance, part fear, part ritual, and part Renaissance aromatherapy session. Did it work? Mostly not, but you have to admire the effort. Coming up, who were those plague doctors anyway, and why did they dress like the goth cousins of Big Bird? Plague doctors, medicine, mystery, and maximum drama. Ah, yes, the plague doctor, arguably the most iconic character of the pandemic cinematic universe, medieval edition. Tall, ominous, rocking a bird beak, long coat, gloves, cane, and a vibe that screams, "I'm here to examine you and your nightmares." But who were these mysterious figures, and did they actually help anyone? Spoiler, debatable. First off, let's set expectations. Plague doctors were not the medieval equivalent of elite ER surgeons. In fact, many weren't even trained physicians. Some were random local guys, clerks, or down-on-their-luck scholars with enough courage or desperation to take the gig. Why? Because no one else wanted the job. I mean, would you volunteer to hang out with highly contagious patients while wearing a mask that made you look like a cursed carnival prop? The famous bird beak mask wasn't just a bold fashion statement. The beak was stuffed with herbs, spices, or sponges soaked in vinegar to filter the deadly air. Think of it as a medieval N95 if it was designed by a horror movie director and functioned at about 3% effectiveness. The rest of the getup? Long waxed coat, because shiny equals sterile, right? Wide-brimmed hat, style points, and gloves. Oh, and a cane, not for walking but for poking patients from a safe distance. You alive? No? Cool. Their duties? Pretty grim. They diagnosed the sick, counted the dead, carried out basic treatments, like bloodletting and lancing buboes, yum, and sometimes even did autopsies. Many also kept death records, which were probably the most useful thing they did. Because let's be honest, no amount of sage smoke was going to cure the Black Death. But credit where it's due, plague doctors showed up. They walked into chaos armed with pseudoscience, peppercorns, and an unshakable sense of doom. Were they effective? Yeah. Were they brave? Absolutely. Would we swipe right on one? Probably not. Next up, religion, superstition, and why people thought whipping themselves might cure the plague. Yes, it gets weirder. Pray it away, and maybe whip yourself a bit. When the plague rolled into town, people naturally turned to the one thing that seemed more powerful than leeches or vinegar-scented beak masks: God, or the gods, or demons, or astrology. Honestly, the Middle Ages were equal parts religion, superstition, and we have absolutely no idea what's going on, but let's light a candle just in case. Churches were flooded with terrified souls praying for deliverance. Public processions, masses, and religious fasts became epidemic-era must-dos. People lit candles, walked barefoot through the streets, and donated everything from coins to livestock in hopes of divine mercy. Imagine trying to bribe the universe with a goat. But sometimes, prayer just didn't feel enough. Enter the flagellants. These were roving bands of extremely pious folks who decided the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. So naturally, they took off their shirts and started publicly whipping themselves. Hardcore. They believed that by physically punishing their own sinful bodies, they could save the world. Because nothing says public health strategy like open wounds in the middle of a plague. They marched from town to town, chanting, bleeding, singing hymns, and gathering huge crowds. Spoiler, those crowds didn't exactly help with disease containment. Also, the church, aka the original brand manager for public piety, wasn't thrilled. The Pope eventually banned the movement, but not before things got wildly out of hand. And then there were the scapegoats. Because let's be real, when people panic, they look for someone to blame. Outsiders, religious minorities, women, even cats were accused of spreading the plague. Yep, cats. So naturally, people killed off tons of cats, which ironically made the rat problem worse. Big medieval oops. All this chaos makes one thing clear. When fear takes over, logic tends to leave the chat. But beneath the madness, there was a genuine human impulse to make sense of the senseless, even if it meant bleeding in the streets or blaming a tabby. Next up, how governments and institutions responded. Hint, slowly, unevenly, and occasionally with actual competence. When the government shows up late with a torch and a prayer. You know how in every disaster movie there's always a scene where the government official shows up, looks around, and says, "We weren't prepared for this?" Yeah, that's pretty much how medieval authorities handled pandemics, except instead of hazmat suits, they had robes, scrolls, and occasionally a blessed chicken. When the plague started spreading, governments and rulers mostly panicked like everyone else, just with fancier furniture. Kings, princes, and city councils scrambled to respond, but public health as we know it didn't really exist yet. There were no ministries of health or centers for disease control, just a lot of praying, guessing, and locking doors. Still, some places actually tried to take action. Italian city-states like Venice and Milan, always the overachievers, led the charge with early quarantines, plague hospitals, and health boards. Yes, actual committees were formed to deal with the outbreak. Their job? Enforce rules, collect bodies, isolate the sick, and occasionally burn down infected property. Bureaucracy, but make it medieval. Elsewhere, royal courts issued plague ordinances, bans on travel, limits on gatherings, rules for burials. Sound familiar? It's like reading a COVID policy from 1348, just with more parchment and fewer PDFs. Of course, enforcement was hit or miss. In some towns, rules were strict and actually followed. In others, officials either fled, classic move, or ignored everything until half the population was dead. And let's not even talk about medical licensing. Anyone with a robe and a confident attitude could call themselves a plague expert. To be fair, some rulers genuinely tried. Queen Joanna of Naples paid for plague doctors. The city of Dubrovnik established one of the first quarantine zones. Even the Pope moved to Avignon and sat between two massive fires because someone told him fire could purify the air. Medieval air purifiers, folks. So yes, the state showed up, eventually, sometimes with real solutions, sometimes with holy water and hope. But in a world where every answer raised 5 new questions, even a half-decent response was something. Coming up next, what did people actually do to treat the plague? Spoiler, it involved a lot of onions, blood, and questionable potions. Plague cures, hope in a bottle, or an onion, or mercury. So, you've got the Black Death, you're covered in painful buboes, fever's raging, things are not looking great. Time to go see your friendly neighborhood medieval doctor, right? Well, buckle up, because you're about to experience the most chaotic healthcare plan in human history. Let's start with the obvious. No one had a clue what actually caused the plague, so treatments ranged from the mildly questionable to the downright apocalyptic. One of the go-to methods? Bloodletting. The logic was simple. You're sick, your blood is probably evil now, so let's just drain it out. Bonus points if you also had leeches involved. Sometimes they'd even slice open your buboes to let the poison escape, because nothing says healing like open sores and medieval knives. Then came the herbal remedies. And honestly, some of these weren't too bad. Things like sage, mint, or garlic. Not exactly a cure, but at least you'd smell nice while dying. Other options included onions, raw or boiled, crushed emeralds, or mixtures of vinegar, honey, and random plant parts. It was basically medieval kitchen witchery. And, oh boy, let's not forget mercury treatments. That's right. People literally rubbed mercury on their skin or inhaled the fumes. Yes, mercury. The thing that's toxic even in small doses. The cure was often worse than the disease, but hey, at least it felt dramatic. If that wasn't enough, there were also potions made from dried toads, powdered unicorn horn, spoiler, not real, and, brace yourself, mummified human remains. That's right, mummy dust was medicine. Doctor, I have a fever. Ah, yes, here, snort some 2,000-year-old pharaoh. Classic. And then you had the don't eat this or you'll die diet plans. No fruit, no meat, no sex, no exercise, no laughter. Basically, if it brought joy, it was banned. The tragedy, of course, is that people were desperate. They tried everything because anything was better than nothing. Some treatments may have offered comfort or even placebo-level relief. But most? Snake oil with a side of superstition. Next time you grumble about modern medicine, just be glad your doctor doesn't come at you with a toad and a jar of leeches. Coming up, how the plague reshaped society and how some people came out richer, freer, and, weirdly, better off. Plague aftermath, chaos, change, and cha-ching. So, the plague hits, wipes out a chunk of Europe's population. Some estimates say up to 1/3 of people gone. Sounds like the start of a zombie apocalypse, right? But here's the twist. Society didn't just collapse, it changed. And in some weird ways, it actually improved. First, let's talk about the labor shortage. With so many people dead, suddenly workers were in demand. Peasants and craftsmen weren't just cogs in a feudal machine anymore, they became valuable. Landowners had to pay better wages and improve working conditions just to keep the farms and workshops running. Hello, early bargaining power. This shift gave rise to a bit of social mobility. Serfs who had been stuck in their village all their lives found opportunities to move, demand freedom, or start businesses. Some historians even argue the plague helped speed up the decline of feudalism and pushed Europe toward a more modern economic system. Not bad for a microscopic killer. But wait, there's more. The plague also triggered cultural and religious shifts. After witnessing so much death, people started questioning everything. Why was God punishing them? What about the church's role? This skepticism planted seeds for later events, like the Reformation, basically medieval society's version of hold my beer. Artists and writers, meanwhile, got really into macabre themes. Think skeletons dancing, grim reapers lurking, and death as the great equalizer vibes everywhere. It was like the original horror genre, and it still influences pop culture today. Of course, not all change was positive. Fear and trauma led to scapegoating and violence. Jews, foreigners, and other minorities often bore the brunt of blame and persecution. But over time, new public health ideas, city planning, and even early science started taking root. The plague was a brutal wake-up call. You can't ignore disease and expect to survive. So while the Black Death was an unprecedented catastrophe, it also forced society to rethink itself. Sometimes destruction makes way for progress, even if it's a messy, painful process. Next up, what can we learn from medieval responses today? Spoiler, a lot actually.
Medieval lessons for modern pandemics. Spoiler alert, we're not that different. Okay, here's a wild thought. Modern society isn't that different from medieval villages when it comes to dealing with pandemics. We might have smartphones, vaccines, and TikTok, but the basics, fear, misinformation, collective action, are basically the same remix, just with better graphics. First up, isolation and quarantine. Medieval folks figured out that keeping the sick away from the healthy slowed things down. We might call it lockdowns or social distancing now, but the idea was there centuries ago. So yeah, those annoying stay-home orders? Ancient wisdom, baby. Next, the importance of community responsibility. In the Middle Ages, townsfolk were expected to watch out for each other, even if it meant ratting out a neighbor sneaking out of quarantine. Today, that's called public health compliance, but the awkwardness of tattling, timeless. Then there's the whole disinfection obsession. From burning herbs to hand sanitizer, humans have always been obsessed with killing the bad stuff. It's less about magic now, more about chemistry, but the instinct to cleanse, centuries old. And let's not forget misinformation and blame. Medieval people scapegoated minorities or bad air. We've got conspiracy theories and social media trolls now. Same game, new players. So what's the takeaway? History shows us that pandemics aren't just medical crises. They're social and cultural challenges too. We need science, yes, but we also need empathy, clear communication, and collective action. Otherwise, history might just repeat itself, hopefully with fewer plague doctors and more vaccines. Remember, when you're tempted to roll your eyes at mask mandates or lockdowns, Think about folks sealed behind walls or self-whipping in the streets. Makes our 2020s drama look pretty tame, right? Coming next, final thoughts and why understanding the past might just save our future. Why knowing medieval plagues might just save our butts. All right, you might be thinking, cool history lesson, but why should I care about dusty old pandemics from 700 years ago? Here's the thing. History isn't just about dates and dusty scrolls. It's a survival guide wrapped in irony and weird hats. The medieval plague wasn't just a freak event. It was a massive stress test for human society. It exposed weaknesses, forced tough choices, and sparked innovations, not just in medicine, but in how people organized their communities and governments. Fast forward to today, COVID-19 and other modern outbreaks show us the same patterns. Fear, denial, heroism, scapegoating, and the crucial role of collective responsibility. We're walking the same tightrope medieval folks did, just with better tech and worse Zoom meetings. Knowing how they handled isolation, hygiene, and public health helps us understand why certain measures matter, even if they're inconvenient or annoying. It's not just rules for the sake of rules, it's centuries of trial, error, and hard-won lessons. Plus, the medieval story reminds us that panic and misinformation are old enemies, but so are compassion and cooperation. Humans have always balanced on that razor's edge. Learning from their mistakes and successes gives us a chance to do better. So yeah, the Middle Ages might seem like a grimy, plague-ridden nightmare, but they left us with valuable clues about resilience, responsibility, and the messy business of staying human in a crisis. In a world still fighting pandemics, maybe it's time to dust off the past and take notes. Just leave the beak masks and self-flagellating rituals in the history books. Up next, the grand finale, wrapping it all up with a modern twist and a dash of hope. The Medieval Pandemic Playbook, What We Can Take Forward. So here we are, at the end of our medieval plague saga. What have we learned? Well, plenty. The Middle Ages weren't just about knights and castles. They were a wild, chaotic experiment in handling disasters that still echoes today. First, hygiene matters. Even if medieval hygiene was lighting bonfires and sniffing flowers. It wasn't perfect, but they understood that clean air and isolation could slow disease. Today, with germ theory and vaccines, we have way better tools, but the principle is timeless. Second, community responsibility is key. Medieval towns that enforced quarantines and cared for their sick fared better. It's like a reminder that your actions affect others, not just in the Middle Ages, but in our hyper-connected world today. Third, governments need to act, fast and smart. Slow or inconsistent responses only make things worse, whether in 1348 or 2020. And while medieval rulers sometimes stumbled, some showed remarkable leadership. That's a lesson for modern leaders. Crisis demands courage and clarity. Fourth, humans are messy. Fear leads to blame, superstition, and chaos, but it also leads to bravery, innovation, and solidarity. Both sides have been with us for centuries, and probably will be for a long time. Finally, history is our best teacher. By studying how medieval people survived and adapted to pandemics, we get a clearer picture of what works and what doesn't. We also get a healthy dose of humility, remembering that despite all our tech, we're still human. So next time you feel overwhelmed by a health crisis, think about those medieval folks locked behind city walls, smelling burnt herbs, and hoping for a miracle. They faced extinction and somehow laid the groundwork for the world we live in now. And that's the real magic of history. It shows us we're all part of one big, ongoing story. Sometimes terrifying, often ridiculous, but always worth knowing. Thanks for sticking around through this time-traveling plague ride. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, even the darkest times can teach us how to shine brighter.